We can get started. I'm Professor Ara Merjian, and I will give a brief introduction and then introduce our panelists and invite them up on stage. And after our roundtable, we'll also open it up to the audience, which also includes distinguished translators of Rosselli from the Italian, including Roberta Antonini, who is with us. But I'm thrilled to help present this edition of Amelia Rosselli's poetry in English with the New York Review of Books Poets series, which is also available on sale in the lobby, published for the first time in the United States. Writing about Rosselli's poetry in 1963, the poet, director, and polemicist Pierpaolo Pasolini noted its violence. Not an ideological or historical violence, he remarks, but the violence of quote-unquote language alienated against itself. Written the same year as the formation of the Gruppo 63, a neo-avant-garde group whose poetic experimentation would clash stridently with Pasolini's own poetics and more lyrical verse, his text is significant. A poetic language alienated against itself in many ways describes precisely the kind of poetry with which Pasolini took issue at the time. A poetic language that ironically and reflexively reproduces the deformations of bourgeois culture and language. This was exactly the kind of appropriation of linguistic sterility that Pasolini viewed as apocalyptic, a mere play with words which left deeper power structures intact. Why then, among so many contemporary poets that he dismissed and derided or simply ignored, did he revere Rosselli's work? In what lies that which he describes as the crazy coherence of her verse, its mix of what he calls neurosis and mystery? Born in Paris in 1930 to Carlo Rosselli and Merjian Cave, an Englishwoman of distantly Irish origins, Amelia's birth in Paris was the product of exile. Carlo had fled the fascist government the preceding year, founding the anti-fascist movement Giustizia e Libertà, Justice and Liberty, and going on to form part of a kind of Italian popular front against Mussolini's regime from abroad. With Hitler's rise to the chancellery in 1933, the group would increasingly call for radical and revolutionary action, something which Rosselli himself took up in Spain in 1936, rushing to the aid of the beleaguered, democratically elected Republican government under siege by a phalangist coup. But while Rosselli survived the Aragon front, he was not so lucky back in France, where members of France's fascist terrorist group, the Cagoule, likely helped by Mussolini and agents abroad, shot Rosselli and his brother on the night of June 9th, 1937. Melina, as Amelia was known, remained for a few more years in the French capital, speaking both French and Italian, and learning English by her own account only later as a naturalized English citizen in exile, once again from Nazi-occupied France. But it was close by to here in upstate New York, where she settled into grade school and then high school before eventually returning to London and Italy after her mother's death. In a 1987 interview, Rosselli described her early poetic sensibility as quote-unquote post-romantic, a designation that resonates, in a sense, with the lyricism of Pasolini. But though they remained friends and she admired his work, it was ultimately with the neo-avant-garde set of poets with which her work is most often sorted. Some of her poems in English, too, first appeared in a magazine edited, among others, by John Ashbery, someone we might think of as a kind of American equivalent of the Italian neo-avant-garde in his verse. Vernacular, dogmatically informal, a poetic voice disabusing itself of encrusted styles and schemas by way of irony, often even flippancy. For her part, Rosselli constructs verse in English, it seems to me, somewhere midway between the hermetic and the anecdotal, the dead serious and the jocular. We are three in our tree, eating, if permissible, skies and flies, or battles roving in our eyes. Across the page from this play with sound, or the sound of play, read lines entirely dialogic, conversational, but also wounded, recoiling. Quote, you might as well think one thing or another of me. I'm not at mercy's chance, nor do I want your interpretation. And so, as expert guides for the night to this polyphony of tones and timbres, I invite onto the stage experts far better versed in prosody and in Rosselli than I. And so I'd first like to introduce Isabella Livorni, who is faculty fellow in NYU's Department of Italian Studies, our own. Her academic writing has appeared in California Italian Studies and the Italian American Review, and her translations have appeared in Asymptote and West 86th, among other journals. She's working on a monograph that explores the connections between multilingual and multimedia experimentation in Rosselli's poetry and ethnomusicological research. Professor Alessandro Jame is assistant prof of Italian studies at Yale, specializing in modern and contemporary literature and art. He is the author of Ariosto in the Machine Age, due out with University of Toronto in the coming year. Nell'Officina del Nonsense di Totti Scialoia, which came out in 2014, and co-editor with myself of the recent Heretical Aesthetics, Pasolini on Painting, which came out with Verso a couple of months ago. His numerous essays and translations have appeared in the Paris Review, Vanity Fair, and Flash Art, and he regularly writes for the national newspapers Domani and Il Manifesto. And finally, our editor of this volume, Barry Schwabsky, is a critic for The Nation and an editor for Art Forum. I'm pleased to say that I know personally all of our panelists, including Barry, who contributed a very interesting essay to a volume that I'm editing, and his expertise extends to poetry as well. His most recent books of poetry include Feelings of And, which came out with Black Square Editions in 2022, and this year's Water from Another Source, which came out with Spuyten Duyvil. The most recent issue of the British Literary Review, Snow, contains his translation of the complete French poetry of Giuseppe Ungaretti. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Isabella, Alessandro, and Barry. Yeah, you can start.
Okay, I'll just start.
Okay, sure.
Hi, thanks for coming, and I really appreciate your coming to hear and find out about, if you don't already know, the English language poetry of Rosselli. I have to make one correction, which is that I'm not the editor of the book. There's no kind of stated editor. Our text comes from the Italian publisher directly and without further, let's say, redaction. Very good, thank you. But I wrote the introduction to it, and it's a project that I've wanted to see happen or try to make happen if nobody else would do it for many years. And I was recently thinking about all that led up to this book happening, and I decided to write another little essay that would be partly about how I came to do this, and partly about what's the use and what's the point of an introduction to a book of poetry. And even though it's a short essay, I think it's too long for this particular occasion, but I'm going to try and give an abbreviated version of it, and then after that read some of the poems from the book. And so it's called an afterword to an introduction. A book of poetry can be illuminated by any number of specialized research methods, philological, biographical, or what have you, and all these approaches are of value. Everything they reveal may be precious for some readers, but they can intimidate as much as they inform. When they precede the text itself, they can sometimes recall the sign often seen on scaffolding in Italy surrounding monuments under restoration, vietato ai non addetti ai lavori. When we poets publish our own books, we do it without such warnings. Difficult as the poems may happen to be, we postulate that potential readers will negotiate them in their own ways, in accordance with their own pleasure, and that the knowledge necessary to this encounter cannot be determined in advance. If nonetheless we accept without question that kind of preemption in the case of the publication of a book that is already well known, Leaves of Grass, let's say, or Ossi di Sepia, or whatever it may be, that's probably, at least in part, because it's also implicit that there are, have been, and will be many such introductions. The implicit cacophony of their differences and disagreements cancels out, or at least ameliorates, the imputed authority of each one. However, in presenting a book that is neither new nor well known, the writer of an introduction faces a different problem. An explanation seems called for. Why this belated appearance? That's the implicit question I had to address in writing an introduction to Sleep. Available to Italian readers with facing translations into their own language for more than 3 decades, Sleep had never been completely presented to an Anglophone readership. I should explain that my own engagement with Rosselli's work dates back to the 1980s. Having lived in Milan in 1981-82 and again in 1987-88, I first read Rosselli's Italian poetry sometime during that decade. I don't really remember when, although I remember having passionate conversations about her work with my dear late friend, the poet Franco Gentillucci, during that period of 87-88. I picked up the 1992 Garzanti edition of Sleep, Poesie in Inglese, probably toward the end of the 1990s, and quickly became fascinated and also puzzled by it. This was a poetry different from anything else I knew in English, but neither was it exactly written in the language of a foreigner, as was the case with some other poets of English as a second language who'd interested me, such as the Czech Ivan Blatný. Rosselli's was a poetic artifice that could be estranging, yet was full of echoes from the history of English poetry. And when Rosselli's Italian poetry finally began to become known in the English-speaking world in the early 2000s, I kept imagining a publication of her English verse would necessarily soon follow. Whenever I had a chance, whenever I thought I had the ear of someone who might be able to bring the idea to term, not as often as I'd have liked, I have to admit, I talked up the idea. In reviewing one of the books of translations, I made a call for it, and yet that only managed to bear fruit nearly a decade later, when I managed to spark the interest of that percipient editor and dyed-in-the-wool Italophile Edwin Frank of New York Review Books. All that's to say that I ended up writing the introduction to this book not as a scholar of modern Italian poetry in general, or of Rosselli in particular, but as a poet who developed a passionate enthusiasm for and fascination with the work of a fellow poet, whom I cannot think of as a purely historical figure, but rather as an elder contemporary, not unlike John Ashbery, who, as Ara said, first published 6 of the poems from Sleep in Art and Literature in 1966, or Leslie Scalapino, or Wanda Coleman, or any number of others who most decisively helped me get a sense of what poetry could be in the present and have continued to do so even since their deaths. It was this intuition of the continuing, or really, I'd rather say, merely incipient currency of sleep that led me to conclude that the best way to introduce the book was not to try to give a thorough interpretation, nor to give more than a few basic indications of Rosselli's dramatic, not to say tragic, life story, except insofar as it would explain to readers new to her how this Italian poet had come to write in Italy a collection of poetry in English. which meant explaining that her mother had been English and that after the assassination of her Italian Jewish father in 1937, she had grown up in Westchester County, New York. In covering that, I passed over some of the other most salient aspects of her work, notably her profound immersion in music and musicology, and her political commitment as a member of the Italian Communist Party. I saw my task as primarily to offer an outline of the book's publishing history and to recall the status quo of Anglo-American poetry at the time Rosselli began her career in the 1950s. Notably, before the overt splitting off between what Donald Allen, in his famous 1960 anthology, would call the New American poetry of the Black Mountain Beat and New York School groups, and then of the so-called British Poetry Revival on the one hand, and the more conservative trend represented, for instance, by the 1957 anthology, New Poets of England and America, edited by Donald Hall, Robert Pack, and Louis Simpson. Working at a distance from the conflicted internal politics of Anglo-American poetry, Rosselli's writing ignored the well-policed boundary lines between them, though the result was far more radical than anything in the Hall anthology, and for that matter, than much of what was in Allen's book, too. I wanted then to alert readers that something unfamiliar was about to hit them as they read the book, but without trying to define for them what that would be. It was merely a question of answering a few simple questions that any reader might have. What is this book? How did it come to exist? Why didn't I know about it before? And why might it be worth the trouble of reading it now? In trying to address that last why, my main object was to give a sense of the texture of the poetry, the surface the reader first encounters, which is, I believe, the main location also of its depths. After that, readers should be on their own. And though it might be delusional to present Rosselli as what I nonetheless cannot stop feeling she is, a living poet, I wanted to accord the life of her verse its freedom and openness, including the openness to what might be misunderstanding or ignorance, rather than restraining it with premature definition. So now I just want to read some pages from the book. I haven't pre-selected them. I gave a reading of some of these at another place a little while back, and it was so difficult for me to choose favorites from the book. I decided I'm just going to open it at random, and whatever I find, I'm sure is going to be great. Radioactive confusion bit into my brain, radiant with multitudes. Unexpectedly, the lights warm in a heart went out for the pleasure of separation. Encountering the bell flashing in the eyes of the partisan of a good cause, I collapsed into fits of apology, bragging into the tear-rid apostrophes of saints. Belonging to a race of saints, the upshot of this long separation, which we ourselves must set to our pleasures, the wind entered the broken-boned part of the heart, freezing in a winter grip. Assertion of individuality broke up the Cupid love he held for senseless mates of joy. Regardless of impossibility, the fire turned over the spittled chicken as it twisted plumed. Against triviality, the spit hung a banner, pierced through your heart, encountered flames of lust. Through the keyhole of an old woman's bedroom door appeared to the distraught eye the weight of all disaster. The soft agate eye of the neighbor had transfixed my imagination, which bent into ulterior motives such as weariness and the best attirement for some kind pain which would forever guarantee another life. The other life, however, displayed a rather forgetful costume, simpering against the heavy rain turning into a marasmus, my forgetful heart now reminded of its own weariness as the car drove through the blank hills. You would not take responsibility. You would not wipe the hinge clean. You would not be a body rocking through life or slenderly rapping out withering tunes. You would be a body meddling with traps and sorrowing, overshadowing your own traps. You would be a body tenderly terrifying the mice, and your soft heart is stuck through, sunk quietly. You would sink quietly, ring bells with beards and beard mice through to not shadow, not willingness to testify that you were born. I am so much in your power that you do not know how to keep me from doing your best now that you have sworn to lose me. I am so much in your power that you do not see the key keep the witch. She trembles on the way to higher affairs, trembles lest you peer at her, seeing her infusions in the gaudy night. You do not keep me, you refer to me, thinking I will be calm. But by destiny, she horrifies patrons, peasants, and her witchcraft provokes no sound, save that cry which tense in the night suffers that you be gone from her apparel, her mind twerking to see you gone, left off, become a divinized affair on a loose branch crackling down. Actually, I was amazed with that poem to discover that twerking was already something circa 1960 or whenever that particular poem was written. I thought it was a much later arrival. I'll just read a couple more. Long before the summer had flown, green grass rotted on the ground. Long before my heart and yours had played out, the green grass came to sprout again. Long before the meter of our love had fixed itself, my heart had given out, and the sun still shone liquid and staring at my tired eyes. Long before you had ever played with chance, chance had forgotten you. Then we were all mute. Long before we had rested in iniquity, chance had played its part. And then she left the convent, the interminable sickbed. Then she left the charity, and she found hope. Then she left. Why do you want to dream? Why cry? Why recite this year's prayers, partaking of vivacity in the world arresting? Why disengage yourself from upheavals penetrating into your sound blood? This year's tiger sings, he crashes into this year's arms. And this year's lovely widowhood sings, it rests in 3 arms. Noe, the singer and the bird nestling frank into the arms of a bushberry, partaking of this year's merriness. Please sing. Please nod your head gravely or graceless, intending I should marry. Think about it. Purse your lips, partake of this night's advantages merrily. And he souped with his soul that night, crying in a wilderness which was not frank, but gave thought to thought, alphabet to words, or engraved sorrows in a line, comforting your bedless grace. And sitting with the birds that cried willingly to please his God, who sat watching all mysteries from afar, regardless of their soul, which, turning the round point, saw him sitting restlessly behind their backs, waiting for their arrival in the juicy period of grace, its listless charm, its annoyance at being first led, then challenged, and rounded the point, and fed its grace, and withal seemed to rest in his grace. 3-pointed grace. Forgive our sins as we forgive those that sin them. Thanks.
Okay. All right. I'm in the mic. I think we're all good with the live stream. I've been told to speak into the mic. Yeah? Okay. All right. Thank you all. And thank you so much for having me. And thank you to the Casa for having us. Thank you to Ara for inviting me. And for Barry for the thoughtful new edition in a way, introduction and representation to sleep. No, okay. So, like most of Rosselli's collections of poetry, I know you didn't necessarily do the actual edition of it, but it is a really complicated little book that has very many layers of editorial history, which you need to go into the archives to really look at and understand. But it's admirable, I think, that Barry has included not only the poems officially included as part of Sleep, but also the excluded poems and Rosselli's self-translations. There are two other translations of Emanuela Tandello's into Italian, Emanuela Tandello's and Antonio Porta's. And she worked very closely with them to do that, but let's focus on Rosselli. So I've actually spent the last 6 years and probably many more researching the period of Rosselli's life that the poems from Sleep were written in. So that's from 1953 to 1966. So this period was not only the most fertile one in Rosselli's life poetically, which is something that Barry notes in his introduction, but it was also particularly productive in her life as a performing musician, an electronic composer, and an amateur ethnomusicologist. And here I work a lot on Rosselli and music, but I want to offer a few notes on Rosselli's intellectual, political, and ethical formation and how it comes to bear on her poetry. So Rosselli, she famously described herself as a poeta della ricerca, a poet of research, and much of the actual research that she conducted in the 1950s and the 1960s sat at the intersection of the avant-garde and the ethnographic. In her mind, her poetry was no exception. And when Pasolini, as Ara has cited, when Pasolini wrote the introduction to her first poems published in Italian in 1963 in Il Menabò, Vittorini's publication, this kind of served as her introduction to the Italian literati. And she was actually privately annoyed at Pasolini's insistence that her work was an example of mystery, neurosis, and the myth of the irrational. So if you go into the archives in Pavia, her brother John donated many of their letters. I think he did some redacting. But she wrote to her brother John in one of these letters, quote, "I would have spoken rather of the mito del razionale, the myth of the rational." And just as a parenthetical, it's very interesting to read Rosselli's English in the poems after reading so much of Rosselli's English in the archives, because she wrote to John primarily in English, and it is a much more kind of, her English is not careful there. She's always using false cognates, and it almost seems unintentional. I'm sure it's fine, it's fine because John was also trilingual. But it's interesting there that Barry formulates very well in the introduction to this volume. Quote, "Rosselli's music of linguistic noises is strictly measured. The passionate violence of her language is rational, her expressive extremism steeped in formality." And I think Rosselli would have very much appreciated that formulation. But returning to Pasolini's note, Rosselli was annoyed that Pasolini saw particularly her linguistic mixtures as lapsus, is what he called them, or Freudian slips. And so she actually explained, quote, "My mixtures linguistically are rarely mixtures at all, but refer to baroque or absurd turns of phrases or syllables in use in Italy, especially in the South, in the poetry of Campana, in dialect, or in other languages." So in other words, her language is not something that springs only from her own psyche. It is a distillation of her studies of other languages, other Italians, and in particular of the outsiders within Italy. So she mentions Southern Italians, and she mentions Dino Campana, who was, the visionary, mentally ill poet who lived on the fringes of various major Italian literary circles in the early 1900s. And she loved Campana. She loved other kind of, quote, outsider poets like Scipione, Penna, Calogero. But in any case, what reads as irrational to Pasolini is, in Rosselli's articulation, a search for aesthetic production that better elucidates relationships and communications between self and other. The idiosyncrasy of Rosselli's language is meant to be fruit of the study of and absorption of others' idiosyncrasies. So she put this pretty lucidly in a 1992 interview. Quote, "For me, writing is necessary to bring new richness to my and others' interiorities. This is poetry's ethical valence," end quote. So for much of Rosselli's life, of course, as Barry mentioned, she was caught up in questions of ethics and politics. In other words, really how to conceive of the relationship between self and other. Of course, she was a member of the PCI, the Communist Party. Some people say it started in 1958, but I've found evidence that even before then, in like 52. And even more to the point for my purposes here, she was very involved in ethnomusicological and ethnographic research that really shaped her approach to politics, ethics, and poetics. So through people like poet and politician Rocco Scotellaro, artist and writer Carlo Levi, and anthropologist Ernesto De Martino, she got involved in ethnographic attempts to shed light on marginalized rural southern Italian communities in the 1950s. During this period, she was also attempting to discover a universal musical system that was shared by folk music from all over the world. And so she gained access to the materials that she was studying through recordings, primarily at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. So I'm not actually going to go into detail here about Rosselli's attempts to discover a universal musical system because it's quite detailed. I'm happy to provide detail for anyone who's interested after this, but I will say that her hypotheses were very improbable. But the point is, the quest for universals in music matches up with the quest for universals in language that she articulates in her famous Statement of Poetics from 1962, revised in 1964. In the wake of World War II, fascism, genocide, colonialism, events that intimately affected her and her family, she was looking for elements that unified human artistic practice and communication across race, culture, gender, class, and language. Hers is a dream of transparent communication from every artist to every person who interacts with that art, regardless of background and context. She is seeking some common ground, a universal substrate of perception and communication that could make the self and the other legible to one another. And Rosselli's poetry seems to rehearse the attempt and failure of accessing that universal transparent communication over and over again. So here I'll cite from some of the poems of Sleep. One that Ara just cited, quote, "You might as well think one thing or another of me. I am not at mercy's chance, nor do I want your interpretation, having none myself to overpower me." In another poem, the speaker desires to transmit a message in code with her mind, a message that ultimately the addressee refuses to receive. Quote, "A mind tapping out the message you'll not want to read, pleasing yourself with my confusion," end quote. And so in the following stanza, the speaker's knowledge of her own mind code is then called into question. Quote, "A mind that does not know its code, yet in shallow water so cold braces up against the mortified soul. You may hear it squinting, it's tearing the map with large fat hands, or withdrawing to diversified code. Its code, its tail, its mush, gray matter." So the way the speaker herself is actually, as she puts it, tearing up the map of the code is enacted through multilingual word association, one of her favorite things. This is a very obvious example, right? It's code, it's tail, associating code with coda, tail. So the quest for total communication between people of different backgrounds and formations articulated in Rosselli's research continuously falls apart in her poetry from this period, not only in Sleep, but in Variazioni Belliche as well. But the poems keep trying, and the quest for total transparent communication is in and of itself a utopian political project that grows out of a preoccupation with how to speak across various lines. This aspect of Rosselli's poetry has historically hardly ever been acknowledged, and this is in part due to the marginality and marginalization of Rosselli in archives and historical records. So actually, none of her musical compositions have been preserved. Her involvement in European ethnomusicology and ethnography in the early post-war has been elided and mostly forgotten. But she was a very important part, especially in Italy, of nascent ethnomusicology. But Rosselli's absence in these records means that it is difficult to reconstruct the intellectual, ethical, and political contexts in which she worked. And this lack of context for the intellectual life behind the poems leads to interpretations of her poetry that focus on hysterical femininity and mental illness. So I appreciate that Barry is taking a very different approach in the introduction to this new edition of Sleep. Rosselli is not mad in the way that Barry presents her. He carefully situates her in a network of Anglo-American influences, which he was discussing earlier, and noting how her strange English can find echoes in the poetry of other Anglo-American poets. I was struck you draw a parallel to Mina Loy in particular. And so Barry's edition, I think, showcases how siloing Rosselli from her Anglo-American contemporaries closes off many fascinating avenues for interpreting Rosselli within her intellectual networks and among her interlocutors. So anecdotally, this was something I was remembering as I was preparing for this talk. In 2018, I met Bruce Andrews, the American language poet, and he told me that he met Rosselli at a conference here at NYU, organized by Luigi Ballerini. It was between avant-garde US poets and contemporary Italian ones. I think it was in 1991. Yeah. So I wrote to him actually as I was preparing this talk to make sure that I was remembering. He says what he recalls, this is not related, but I think it's amusing. He recalls everybody was fascinated by Rosselli, especially because at a certain point she asked for a pat of butter to put in her coffee. So, in any case, so I wrote to him and I was asking for more information about what he remembered. And he replied saying that overall he wasn't very impressed by the radicalism of the contemporary Italian poets present at the conference, and that Rosselli was the exception. He said she sparkled moodily, and her radicalism was the most interesting to him. So then, of course, my question is which other Anglo-American poets might have interacted with Rosselli throughout her life and recognized her skill along with her intellectual and political commitments, as Andrews is highlighting her radicalism in all senses. As scholars, we only have to gain, I think, by putting Rosselli in conversation with the networks and influences that shaped her and that she shaped, combating the absences and the lacunae in the archive. And I think that Barry's edition is a precious tool in this endeavor, so thank you very much.
I'm so glad I asked you to go before me because I really enjoyed listening to you both. Isabella, I'm so admired by your scholarship on Rosselli. I'm so happy that Barry made this book happen, although I imagine it took some patience and some effort, because I feel like I should self-position as mostly a teacher of Rosselli and an incredible admirer of Rosselli, because I grew up in Rome. I'm a product of Italy's public school system, and since high school, since the last year of high school, thanks to a very good textbook, not professor, I must say, but the textbook had a text by Amelia Rosselli, and I fell in love with Rosselli, and I never had the courage to write about her, mostly because I would say Italian scholarship about, Italophone scholarship about Amelia Rosselli does not, in my experience as a reader, interact much with her poetry. And so listening to you, Isabella, and looking at this book, I feel like finally, after some time, after more than 20 years since her death, Rosselli is getting back to the kind of voice that she actually had. I studied at La Sapienza, so I feel like Amelia Rosselli is a bit of my intellectual grandmother, because I studied under the supervision of a great poet and scholar, Bianca Maria Frabotta, who was a keen reader of Rosselli and a mentee of Rosselli. And so I'm extremely intimidated by this kind of ancestral figure. I asked Bianca Maria Frabotta, can I do my laurea tesi on Amelia Rosselli? And she answered, no. And that was it. She said, do Toti Scialoia, it's more leggero. I'm like, sure. She wrote one of my favorite essays about Rosselli in History of Italian Literature, curated by Asso Rosa, but it's a very difficult to understand text. There's a lot of obscurity in the scholarship about Rosselli when it's not biographical. And when it is biographical, it tends to insist very much on aspects of Rosselli that do not help us read her poetry. So I'm very happy that in the swift, clear, useful introduction that Barry wrote, and in Isabella's wonderful paper, the wonderful discorso the response that she just gave us, those aspects are not underlined, and other more important, including especially ethnomusicology and electronic music. I'm obsessed with the chronicles from Rome of Rosselli's performances with Carmelo Bene, with incredible, legendary figures of underground Roman coolness of the 60s. One thing that I wanted to say is that the genre of the introduction to Rosselli's poetry is a very complicated one, because most people that write introductions to Rosselli's poetry tend to write books that are longer than the book. The trinity, of course, is Giovanni Giudici, Emanuele Tendello, and Jennifer Scapettone. I'm very happy you say that this is not an edition, of course, because philologically it's not, but it is a new edition in the sense that it is quite unprecedented. It's quite incredible to have a New York Review of what it means to have a book like this, of an Italian poet who published English language poems in Italy. To have it in America and not in England. There's a strong reception of Rosselli in the United Kingdom. In a way, less here. To put her in touch with the Anglo-American, with Emily Dickinson, and not just with Sylvia Plath. Of course, in the Amelia Rosselli was the one of the most incredible translators into Italian of Sylvia Plath, and a keen reader of Sylvia Plath. And of course, the myth of Rosselli's closeness to Sylvia Plath is also related to the fact that she died on the same day, exactly 30 years later, right? But there's much more. There's much more dialogue. And Mina Loy is. I'm ecstatic because I teach a course on gender and the avant-garde, and we do Rosselli and Loy together, and it totally makes sense for many reasons. And I came here from New Haven, where in the Beinecke Library there are the manuscripts that Mina Loy wrote in a very Rossellian Italian when she was in Florence. There is an unpublished novel called Brontolivido, and a manuscript called Gli Ebrei that she wrote about her interaction with the avant-garde, not the new avant-garde back then. No, she was in touch with futurists, with Marinetti and Soffici especially, and her ironic, amused, scintillating, and I would say radical relation with those men is very similar, I would say, in tone and in method with that Rosselli had with the Gruppo 63, to which she has been strongly connected. But really, she mostly mocked them, and she mostly found them provincial and old, and then, provincial. Like, they were not as cultivated as her. She had an incredible transnational, multilingual culture. What I want to underline is how much... Well...
She likes some of his stuff. And other times she wrote some critical reviews.
And also, if you read her poem Palermo 63, which is a cento, so it's an experiment of like collating bits of the speeches that at the convegno di Gruppo 63 happened, a lot of the bits that she is using to mock as Antonio Porta's bits. And also Antonio Porta is very interesting. Antonio Porta, at a certain point in his path, changes. Like a lot of the novissimi poets abandon novissimousness and go towards classicism. Porta had this kind of Damascus, like Porta introduced also Bianca Maria Frabotta's first book, became interested in women poets in a bit of a paternalistic way, and also Porta was a very good speaker of English.
Can I just interrupt and just ask if you can tell us, how did she feel about Cenzotto, who I know appreciated her very much? What was, do you know what was her view of him?
I don't know.
I think she appreciated him as well. Who she really couldn't stand was Sanguinetti. He was just the worst of the worst.
Who can stand Sanguinetti? But also però ecco, Zanzotto also we cannot say part of Gruppo 63, no? Like, so there's an interesting... two things I wanted to say. One is the reception myth of Amelia Rosselli is very misleading. Amelia Rosselli is a canonical poet in Italian poetry. She is in high school anthologies. She is, of course, Pasolini's introduction had a strong impact, but what I think is super important is that there is one famous anthology of Italian poetry, Poeti del Novecento, edited by Pier Vincenzo Mengaldo, who is this guy, great philological like mensch. Rosselli is the only woman that appears in that anthology, which altered her reception very much. She's always remembered as the only woman of Gruppo 63, which is totally fake. There were like 8 women at the first commercial, but all of them tend to be remembered as the only woman. So Giulia Nicolai, Patrizia Vicinelli, Rossana Ombres, all of the Carla Vasio are the only woman of Gruppo 63. Rosselli is often remembered in bio sketches and on Wikipedia, if I am correctly, l'unica donna del Gruppo 63. She had an Elefante, which is this Garzanti edition. She had a Meridiano, so these books that for Italian readers of poetry and especially scholars of poetry are elements of canonization. And I remember very, very well, as an undergrad, there was this project, one of the first projects of digital humanities in Italy, La Bibliografia della Poesia del Novecento at La Sapienza. All the other poets of the Secondo Novecento were set in their years of which they were most active. But 2 poets, Elio Pagliarani, another novissimo, and Amelia Rosselli were just maestri del Secondo Novecento. So there is an element of considering Amelia Rosselli the most relevant, the most important poet of the second half of the 20th century in Italy is not strange. What is strange is to read her in her own terms. So read her poetry, interpret her poetry beyond the biographical, the martyrdom of her father, beyond her death, beyond her health. And in the terms of that she cared about and she wrote about a lot. The other thing that I wanted to say, I loved that the introduction by Berri ends on a note of relation and of trying to put Rosselli on a bookshelf, which is exactly what you did. No, you put her on a very visible bookshelf that it promises to make her reception change direction and also attract kind of readers that she could not from the books that already exist. But you also speak about her loneliness. If I'm correct, you say the syntagm is, I have all my books here, so I cannot check it, but I think it is stylistic loneliness. She's stylistically lonely. You say something like that.
I can't remember the exact wording, but yeah, something like that.
I'm going to check it. So on that, I wanted to enlarge the company of strangers in which she can be put in by calling to our mind John Milton, who wrote in Italian and wrote in Italian about Italian, and his syntax, his poetic syntax, although very Petrarchan, falls into the same slips that, of course, Pasolini would not call neurosis, but can be connected with the kind of multilingual approach, playful approach to language that Rosselli had. Giulia Nicolai, another multilingual Gruppo 63 associated poet. I was struck by rereading, it's the first time that I read only in English Sleep in my life. I always read it with testo fronte, and I tend to look at the Italian, which is much worse. In any version, it's just not enough. And there are 2 poems about Otello and Desdemona, no? And there's a poem about Otello who takes the wheel in hand, no? Prende il timone in mano. It's not the timone. Otello without an H, and then Desdemona. And this made me think of when Giulia Nicolai in the 1980s, after abandoning her most neo-avant-garde phase and entering the phase of the free space, she writes in English, but in Milan, I had an epiphany, Desdemona, Othello, hell, demon, that inside these 2 words, connecting to the first ever document in Italian, which is Indovinello, a riddle, in which black and white produce writing. And I'm getting a bit nerdy now. Però Giulia Nicolai, Alberto Savigno, translingual Italian author, arguably Italian, Greek, French, German, and an author, exactly, whose interest and culture and work in music has been mostly elided by criticism. And an author in this room, Jhumpa Lahiri, who recently wrote a remarkable book of poems. I mean, she didn't write it. So there is a philology fiction exercise in which she edited a book of an author that doesn't exist, whose name is Nerina for Guanda. The book is called Il Quaderno di Nerina, in which is a meta book of poems, in which very similar things happen that happen in Amelia Rosselli's poetry, both in Italian and in English. And so, like, I think, like, this morning I wanted to write down these notes and then read them, and then I didn't have the courage because Rosselli intimidates me. The title that I thought of for these 4 pages was Poetry is Always Foreign. And I feel like I'm very thankful that your book helped me remember this. And I love the fact that it just moved without changing form and is accompanied by an incredibly readable and easy to teach introduction. So thank you for this gesture to Italian culture.
Good. Thanks.
So we can now start opening things up for discussion and questions. I'll start off just with the first question for all of you is, in this kind of polyphonic, plurilinguistic world that is sleep in particular, which doesn't bear titles, right? All of the poems are essentially elencati by the first line of the first line of each poem, right? Are there a couple autonomous lines that are autonomous from them? Yeah. But in terms of its, I mean, one of the things that's most striking in reading it is that in terms of both length, in terms of typographic regularity compared to some of her other poetry in Italian, there is. My question is, what is the center of the book for a reader unfamiliar with Rosselli? Either the affective center, the stylistic center. Is there kind of a center or an anchor, or is the point that one is, in a sense, also at sea with her in a language that never really settles into, or seems to settle into, one particular furrow, really?
I mean, is this working? Yeah. I mean, the idea that I took for a theme was that it's a kind of recurrent attempt to respond to the male demand on the woman, and both in the history of poetry, all the addresses of male poets to women who dissatisfy them or not or whatever, and turning all that on its head. And yes, I guess maybe somebody would say today, taking control of that discourse. I mean, but then that's, of course, only the beginning of the story, because you can then start to read that as being inflected simply by the idea of how does the poem itself face its reader. Maybe the reader is also this male who's being derided and rejected, and then sometimes receiving affection and so on.
It's super interesting to me that you gender so much. I loved it because it's something that you mentioned in the introduction. And of course, it helps making Rosselli speak with the whole tradition of lyricism and saying, like, okay, a resistance, like a very early modern in the 20th century resistance to the trope of burattinaio di donne, which is a lot of what happens from Petrarch. Però I feel like I want to echo something that on the train from New Haven, my colleague Andrea Capra told me a couple of hours ago, which is that it is a book that can be read as I don't know how to say it in English, a catabasi, like a descent into hell. Like hell is a crucial protagonist of this book, and it is a polysemic. Right? It's not hell in a mere Dantesque sense. I'm thinking more of the catabasi that at the same time Sanguinetti was writing, from Labyrinthus to, and of course Leopardi, and of course Giorgio Manganelli, who is another second half of the 20th century kind of genius author that maybe is in the group of 63 related people is the one that I would say Rosselli would esteem the most. And I just wanted to add that I found the passage, it was stylistically alone, not stylistically lonely.
So I'm really interested in this discussion of gender because Rosselli is, you can see it so much in her poetry. In her interviews, she's very cagey. She's very hedgy. She really doesn't want to be a woman poet. And I think you can see that also in her conversations with Bianca Maria Frabotta. Frabotta pushing, you're a woman poet. Be part of us. And Rosselli's like, I don't think so. Same with Dacia Maraini, who was the partner of her cousin, right? So there was a whole, she knew her quite well. But I think for me, it's definitely present in the poetry. I'm still kind of grappling with how to take all of the denial of gender in her paratexts. And, one way that I've been thinking about it is actually through the lens of the work on rural Southern Italian women. She wrote a piece in 1953, so right at the start, called Cantilena. It's her first set of poems in Italian that she considers valid, though she says later when she reads them that they don't feel like hers. They were for the death of Rocco Scotellaro. And I argue that it's an imitation of a lament that she would have witnessed because she was present in the ethnographic expeditions of Ernesto de Martino in 1952. So there's that, and there's a couple moments where I'm thinking about how she might be engaging with women's material culture. She keeps talking about hell loomed out with perfect hands. She's used that twice in this. And of course, the way that she does, she goes, hell, comma, loomed out with perfect hands, right? It's about the loom. It's about the process of weaving. She has kind of questions of weaving shrouds in her lament for Scotellaro. But I want to just think just generally about prepositions and pronouns in Rosselli's work, which are very key in Variazioni Belliche. So one that you cite, Barry, that I was looking for is benixt, right? We're like, what is that? That's a made-up preposition. That's complete, right? Benixt the shoes that stamp on her heart is the iced river which flows beneath your soul. Okay, again, what's happening? We can't put these figures in relation to one another with the preposition, right? What is benixt? Flows beneath your soul. And nixing, yes. And then she does this in Italian in a different way where she combines prepositions. So she often just won't say contro whatever. She'll say contro di. Like, why do you need that di? You don't need it. She knows she doesn't need it. She knows. She's very aware. Vittorini tried to tell her, hey, that's wrong. That's not good Italian. And she was like, can you please back off? Like, this is my writing. So I think that here in this particular line, you see the kind of central issue of what is happening in these poems, which is people flow into one another. You can't situate them. You can't situate the self, you can't situate the other. In some ways, they are in perfect sintonia. They're perfectly flowing one with the other. In other ways, there is a horrible scontro, or how would you say scontro? Like a clash of yes. And she says this in her manifesto, Spazi Metrici, where she talks about when she's writing that she's sensing and recording the spaces in a room, or the people in a room, actually, the space of the room and the people in the room, and how her subjectivity goes forth and meets with and clashes against the subjectivities in the room with her. So that's how I that's a lens through which I read Rosselli's poetry, especially from this era. Later with the, after 66, 67, Serie Ospedaliera, things shift a little bit, but...
It's so funny, that thing that you pointed out, the loom, has really got my mind going, because the poet that I think of as more of her comparator, if that's the right word, than anyone in either English or in Italian, to me is actually Paul Celan, And there's some loom in Paul Celan as well that now I want to go and find and see what that was. And, because he's also another one of those poets where the melodrama of his life and death, really have somehow outweighed it's been more investigated, at least in the English language world. So, people have gotten into his language, into the form of his poetry, but, in terms of how people get introduced to his work, have really outweighed its specific poetic qualities in the way that's sort of happened with her. But I think also because they're both poets who bear the marks of history more than any other. And
but Celan's poetry is also a real revisitation, right? Running its hand over the wounds of that history in a way that Rosselli's is not, in a different way, right? In a very different way.
Not in sleep.
Yeah.
Not in sleep.
Yeah.
Not in sleep.
In some of the
Maybe
Italian poetry, for
yeah.
sure.
The thing is also like when history and personal history, when storia and storia, clash this way, of course, a big problem of Rosselli's poetry is how to do the two things at the same time. And of course, in dialogue with someone like Sylvia Plath, of course, this becomes a big question, and of course, it's a question of gender as well. The problem of knowing that writing as Amelia, and being perceived as a woman poet could lead to the idea that you're going to write intimist lyricism, come si dice, confessional poetry, and wanting to be in serious dialogue with that stuff, but without, it's a very interesting problem. And about gender is also of course, she authorized a lot of younger women doing someone like Antonella Nedda, possibly one of maybe the greatest Italian poet alive, along with Antonella Nedda, really reading Celan and Rosselli, started writing her own poetry in the 90s. Residenze invernali, which is basically a kind of homage to both Rosselli. And she, in many ways, that kind of poetry is the idea that the lyrical feminine subject could be played out in the poetry as a kind of response to the tradition of is very strong. There is a whole movement in Italy called Fragili Guerriere, something like that recognize we are the inheritors of Rosselli's first epic kind of. Però ecco, il problema is also her own actual performance of gender. If we look at the image, there is apparently a photograph of her in Casa Italiana, in the garden of Casa Italiana. Stefano Albertini told me the problem is that that event happened just the year before Stefano became director, so he does not know where the archive is. But it's her in the garden upstairs with this kind of this hair, this hair, the kind of stuff, la keffia that she put on, that kind of, the Dinognani's photographs of Rosselli also tell a story of a certain kind of performance of her own gender, which is super interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think also it's important to note, right? She never married, she never had children. This was something that she went back and forth on it. She had many love affairs with the kind of some of the most important people that you can imagine. When I was in the archive reading, I was like, this guy too? Oh, that's great. So, no, I mean, Scotellaro, it's interesting, it's very complicated because she always referred to him as a fraterno amico, and he instead was always I was really into her. She had a relationship with Carlo Levi, with Renato Guttuso. So there's a lot of interesting, So I mean, whatever. Without going into gossiping about Rosselli, I'm sorry. But no, I want to say also with her kind of resistance to, she's very resistant to the idea of confessional poetry. And whenever she talks about Plath, she actually is always saying, no, I'm not into the confessional part of it. And you cited even in your introduction, Barry, her her quote about Plath being like, that's not why I'm interested in this. I'm interested in her sense of form. I'm interested in her sense of musicality. She's always putting it back on the literary, the textual level. And I think that's important to remember, especially because, like I said at the beginning of my little discorso, there's a book, I think maybe an anthology, that has as a title one of her quotes, which is to write, well, yes, è vostra la vita che ho perso, yours is the life that I lost, but really the more apt one for me is the question of scrivere e cercare la parola che esprima l'altro, right? To write is to look for the word that expresses the other, right? It's an opening towards the other, which I don't think she necessarily does in a way that is not shaped by her historical circumstances. I work a lot on Rosselli's conceptualizations of cultural and racial difference, and she, I think, in many ways, is difficultly aligned with someone like Pasolini, Alain Danielou working in France, some of the people around the Musée de l'Homme, in a way that, you read it and you're like, this is pretty primitivist. But there is a sense, as I try to explain, right, of a utopian desire in that fertile period of the post-war of thinking like maybe the world order can be changed, maybe we can remap, and she wants to be a part of that, and she wants her poetry to be a part of that as well.
So with that, maybe we can have the audience ask some questions. I'll bring you the mic, and we just ask that you. Oh, okay. Just
thank you. Hi.
into the mic.
Yeah, I will. Can you hear me okay? My question pertains to her being a member of the Communist Party in Italy, correct? In the early 1950s. I'm trying to understand what that might mean, given the fact that she was raised in the United States during the McCarthy era. And no, she was in her early 20s during the McCarthy era. And I'm wondering if the brand of communism that she subscribed to had any bearing on events leading to the Red Brigade's role.
Do you want me to take? Okay, I will say, this is a lot. Rosselli was part of the PCI. She wasn't like a particularly visible member. She did mostly base activities. So she found a lot of gratification in cleaning the base, helping out, working with community members. In a way, it was controversial. She was told her decision to adhere to the PCI. Her brother was not super into that idea. Her psychologist at the time said, "Please do not." So it was contentious, but she felt. She loved Gramsci. She felt like this was really her calling. It was also, her father was a socialist. So it was also, she wanted to be kind of politically engaged like her father had been. She was she was 7 when he died, but she was very invested in his political legacy. And she thought that she didn't want to be a socialist. She didn't find them effective. And so that's why she joined the PCI. As far as the Red Brigades, so obviously, as we all know, the late 60s well into the 70s and 80s were a very difficult period in Italy. And Rosselli's paranoia manifested in these, it's very difficult to read. She has a 1977 essay called History or Story of an Illness, Storia di una malattia, in which she is very anxious about being surveilled as a communist in Italy. And it's a fascinating essay. It's upsetting in many ways, just as the letters in the archive are quite upsetting. But she, I think what's interesting there too is that her persecutions, her ideas of persecution are not in a vacuum. They are not kind of tortured psyche. Yes, they are a tortured psyche, but in the sense that it's not only that, it's always connected to political concerns.
And maybe one thing that I could add, because of course it's a very, like talking about this in America is very estranging, no? And I grew up, the PCI, the Partito Comunista Italiano, is definitely the least, I don't know how to say, the least radical way to be a leftist in Italy in the second half of the 20th century, in the sense that it is the conservative, mainstream, populist in many cases, face of Italian radical culture. And in fact, younger activists in the literary world, such as Dario Bellezza and Bianca Maria Frabatta herself, I would say were feeling that Rosselli and people like Moravia and Guttuso were kind of establishment leftists that would not actually do the revolution because of course, like, we're talking about years in which people, poets like Franco Fortini, of course Pasolini, were actually expecting things to develop into a utopian communist change of government in Italy. And they would feel that people in the Partito Comunista were instead reformers and not revolutionary. So I would say that the Anni di Piombo, although I would say in a justified way, Rosselli was concerned, especially because she knew America better than other Italians. And so she realized that that was not absurd to be concerned about. But she was seen, and probably she was, like not on the extreme, not on the sinistra extraparlamentare, but within a kind of democratic and internationalist tradition of Italian leftists. Of course, it's the biggest communist party in Europe, definitely. I think maybe after the Soviet.
And of course, it was the second biggest party of Italy. So it wasn't.
It's true.
It wasn't
true.
Not an unrespectable position or a weird or marginal position to take. I think that no matter what her paranoid thoughts might have been.
Well, I would say like the right wing was also anti-fascist in the sense that Democrazia Cristiana, we should remember, like, there were Catholic anti-fascists. Anti-fascism is an interesting, but like definitely her, in a way her genealogy, their political genealogy was one related to liberalism as well and internationalism, and her communism was kind of a personal, a cultural, like also studious, like she read the texts. She was not like a naive, and she was not a biographical communist. She was an intentional communist, but in a very intellectual and like kind of mainstream way. She was not going to Democrazia Proletaria. She was not going to Orsa Minore. She was going into collectives of like actual people who were wishing for fight, for war, for civil war.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for such a rich evening and reflection, each of you. I'm so grateful. And Alessandro, thank you for citing me in Rosselli's company. I didn't know anything about Rosselli, as you know, until the day I met you. And we were sitting at a dinner table in Princeton, New Jersey, and Alessandro mentioned Rosselli. I had no idea who she was, and then I went to the library. And anyway, all these years later, I just taught Rosselli in a course at Barnard on exophonic women writers. And I used Jennifer Scapitone's edition, which is wonderful and scholarly and has a lot of material. But I really am so grateful that we have this now, because I think it's going to be much more just ideal for the students to look at this in particular, because, of course, I have a class where maybe 2 students read Italian and the rest don't. So it's ideal to have this, very ideal. So thank you so much. A couple of things. So one writer I think who is really interesting to think about with Rosselli is the Korean writer Teresa Cha, who wrote this incredible book Dictée, which is this trilingual, extraordinary kind of a diary. And she writes in French and English with sort of the ghost of Korean, the Korean language. which is silenced for her parents who grew up in a Korea occupied by Japan, and then Teresa herself moves to New York and also tragically is killed in New York at the age of 31. An amazing poet, writer, artist, I think that who would be very interesting just to open up, because there's a lot of interest right now around her work. Anyway, this is sort of a side comment I just thought I would share. But my question, so I had two things. Has anyone, one is just very tiny, but given everything Rosselli did with language, so the title of this particular collection, Sleep and SLIP, Slip, which is lapsus. Has anyone noted this? Yes, they have. And did she say anything about this in any?
Yes, I believe she did in an interview.
Okay.
I think she did discuss this.
She did. Okay,
yeah,
that's interesting.
I have to check the edition, but I
Okay,
can
I would
send it
love to
along.
know
Yeah.
a little bit about that. And the other thing, exactly. No, the other thing is, speaking of her rigor, the question of form, and I know she had this, whole very articulate theory of the cube, and the cube is very present in Sleep. And I wondered if any of you could talk a little bit more about her, your interpretation of her relationship to the cube, and why you think she called it a cube as opposed to, say, un quadro, a square. Because they're not all technically perfectly square, but she calls them cubes, which is rather fascinating. And though I've read this essay she writes about why she uses cubes, but I just wanted to know, since you are so very knowledgeable about her work, if you could talk a little bit more about her interest in, because again, she deviates from it. Right, and then she has these sort of one-line, incredible, the leaves are crushing the wind kinds of, aphoristic lines as well. So anything to say about the cube? Because I had some theories that I was trying to share with the students about what the cube represented in her poetry.
To me, it's partly to do with this sort of rationalization of what could otherwise be irrational. But the cube, if you want to call it that, or yes, the square, the rectangle, whatever it is not, this is not visual poetry. The cube is invisible. It's the delimitation of the lines. And if at the end of the stanza the line doesn't fill it out, that's okay. It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to be stretched to fit that, but it delimits how far the line will go within a poem in a way that's. I mean, to my mind, it's pretty peculiar because it doesn't have anything to do with syllables, or feet, as in traditional poetry. It has to do with simply the almost physical length of the line. The only other poet that I can think of who does anything like that is James Laughlin, actually, the American who was the publisher of New Directions, and in his late life he started to write a lot of poetry, and he had a particular way of measuring out the lines with usually very short lines, but where he used that delimitation to break phrases and sentences in otherwise peculiar and unexpected ways.
I wanted to say, I think that Isabella will solve this right now. So I'm very excited to hear. I just wanted to say that slip, Freudian slip, is exactly what. So neurosis, Pasolini, Freudian slip, Mengaldo are the two annoying things that she was. I think there is an element of irony here about that kind of attribution of the calembour and the etymological thinking to Freudian slip, which they are not. Però de cubo, Isabella Livorni.
Sì, I love I love the cubo, as Rosselli puts it, you want the cube. That's what she says in the Diario in Tre Lingue from 1955, 1956. And so, first of all, I think it is important. I actually do think there's an element of visual poetry there because Rosselli was very interested in notation. You can go to the archives in Pavia and see her notational sketches, which are incomplete, but she did a whole kind of graphic notation project for John Cage and David Tudor when she went to the Darmstadt Ferry and Kurse in 59 and 61. So there is that, I think, that comes into it. The way I read the cube and the way that I read the cube in my dissertation is has to do with Rosselli's relationship to recording technology. She had a very strong relationship to the tape recorder, to the cinepresa. She has all these stories about how she would walk around Rome recording. And in a sense, especially something like Diario in Tre Lingue and the accompanying very similar text, which is quite interestingly titled Un Chinois à Rome. So, Le Chinois à Rome, I'm sorry, the Chinese man or Chinese in Rome. She is talking about recording the space around her, which then she subsequently does as well in Spazi Metrici. And so I think what she's trying to do with the cube, she's so interested in these technologies that kind of circumvent the need for written notation, right? They record without writing, and that fascinates her. But she wants to go even further. She wants to communicate without mediation. And I think that the cube is almost like a reconstruction. She talks about her poems as the reconstruction of the space around her at any given time, at any given moment. And so the cube is this kind of fantastic utopian idea of a completely unmediated recording. That's my interpretation of the cube. I will say also, it would be interesting, and I haven't done this enough, but to look at Rosselli's relationship with the typewriter, because she talks a good amount about how much she loves the typewriter and how it allows her to type so fast and that she can type at the speed of her thought. And Jennifer Scapettone has written very interesting work connecting Rosselli and Charles Olson in that respect that I think is quite useful. Sorry.
And if I may add two very quick things, two experiments to do with the cube that I make my students do is to listen to Rosselli's reading of her own poetry from pen sound, there are so many online on YouTube, while walking. And it changes the experience and it shows you the kind of, you get to the same. And taking the text, transcribing it on a word and turning the font to Courier Now, or so one of those fonts that have each letter the same space, they change completely. They become visual texts.
She cared about this so much. In the archives, there are 1 million letters of her saying, no, you need to change the typeset. That's not appropriate. I do not like that. Every letter needs to have the same space.
I just want to say regarding the Olson relation, but the interesting difference is that for Olson, this enabled what he called the field.
Yes.
And it's a kind of dispersal of...
But she remembers Olson wrong. That's what's fascinating. So Olson talks about the field. She calls it the magnetic field. She relates it to recording. So that's really...
Wow. Okay.
Sì.
Thank you very much. I was very taken by your discussion of Rosselli as this hyper-rationalist poet, and this is why I would like to bring our discussion to the third pole of Rosselli's trilingualism, meaning French. The history of French philosophy is a struggle against sleep. Descartes' metaphysical meditations begin with that, as this idea of distinguishing between the state of sleep and the state of being awake. There's a long history of French texts that are really obsessed with the idea of formal and rational control over sleep, and this is a tradition that goes from Diderot and d'Alembert's dream, but also in the context of French poetry, to a movement that is emerging in the early 60s, which is the Oulipo. And so the discussion about the cube that you were just having made me think that in some way could also be Rosselli's attempt at taking a stab at what's happening in this kind of tradition of French hyper-rationalism in poetry. Also given the name of this collection of poems, Sleep, that to me is fully Cartesian, as a matter of fact. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about this, and if we can find anything in the archives of Rosselli, her relationship to Descartes' philosophy. Thanks.
I mean, another archive, not the Padua, the Tuscia, Università della Tuscia holds the library of Rosselli's. It's incredible, the level of erudition that she had, and definitely, like, I remembered it because I was there twice, and it was very weird, and they didn't let me take the books from the shops, but I could look at the spines, and I have some pirated photographs that I can share. One thing that I wanted to say about, yes, like it's a wonderfully French arc that you made me think of, because I was thinking about the third, so neurosis, Freudian sleep. The third things that I think annoyed Rosselli, and she declares that a couple of times, is the patent of surrealism that was given to her, and it was basically the filter through which she has been read forever. And still today, you know, peer-reviewed articles that you read about, like the surreal poet, Amelia Rosselli, which is absurd, no? There's nothing that connects her to, no, some things, yes, but definitely not what I thought of, which is exactly the kind of resistance to French rationalism that surrealists had by not sleeping and trying to starve themselves of sleep in order to write without rationality. You know, Rosselli would say maybe she didn't sleep to maintain rationality in a way, but definitely she had problems of insomnia and biographical.
It wasn't just starving themselves of sleep; it was the notion that sleep was, right? I mean, Breton supposedly hung on his door, like le poète travaille, right? That sleep was the font of surrealist poetry, right? And wasn't it? It was a latter-day surrealist poet who kind of introduced her into the whole Grupo 63, right? I can't remember his name, but she talks about this in an interview. But in any case, it's immaterial. I think we have time. We have time for just one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for all the illuminating talks. Barry, you mentioned that the way she deployed English was distinct from other poets who wrote in English as a second language. Could you expand a bit more on that?
Well, I mean, the one I mentioned was the Czech poet Ivan Blatný, and as I read his poetry, his let's say incorrect usages in English were definitely not usually intentional. I think that's the case. I'm not absolutely sure, but yes, I mean, so that's really the kind of distinction I was making. That yes, that it's not a mistake, it's not a lapsus, it's not or whatever. Or even if it started as a mistake in a given instance, it was thereupon chosen determinedly. That's all I meant by making that distinction between her and other poets who were, yes, working with the language that they were less familiar with than their own. Of course, there are other ones that we could think about that probably were equally fluent in both English and another language, but for kind of biographical reasons, their English poetry didn't become that significant. Like I think Cavafy early on, or Pessoa wrote in English, and they were fluent in English, but that didn't become part of their mature work. Yeah, I think
yes, I think you, in this case, right, the titles that she does have, which are, as Ara was noting, are very few, and I actually haven't seen them in any other of Rosselli's poetic collection, actually maybe in the later ones, but not in this time, right? She says, like, the titles are like Webern Opus 4, or there's another one that says like Upon Hearing Dissonance in the Moonlight or something like that. So she was very interested in questions of dissonance. There's been a lot of scholarship on this actually, especially Rosselli's relationship to serialist music. So Lucia Re has written about that, has written about this, as well as Anne Snodgrass, specifically having to do with sleep. She talks about sleep as knowing noise, which I think is a kind of felicitous formulation.
So serialist rather than surrealist.
Yeah.
And then there's the question of serialism versus structuralism in Rosselli's work, which is another big can of worms.
Terrific. Well, everyone, please join me in thanking our